Throughout history, both real and fictitious, love, be it for a romantic interest or even a family member, has driven many a protagonist to do what is considered madness or even the outright impossible. Today's match is a prime example of this. Dante, the condemned Crusader who journeyed through hell to save the woman he loved, versus Death, the horseman of the apocalypse who rode all across creation to save his brother from an unjust punishment. Dante versus Death, the Crusader versus the Kinslayer. In the game, Dante was born in Florence in the year 1156. The son of a greedy, adulterous pig of a man named Alighiero, who also happened to abuse both Dante and his wife until his wife committed suicide. Eventually, though, he met the love of his life in the young Beatrice, and his closest friend in her brother Francesco. When the Third Crusade finally called for mercenaries from Florence, both Dante and Francesco leapt at the opportunity to serve under King Richard Lionheart in the retaking of the Holy Land. Before his departure, Beatrice gave herself to Dante, as they were already set to marry when Dante returned. Dante, in turn, also vowed to forsake all pleasures of the flesh during his departure from Beatrice. But with the promise of a preemptive absolution from all sins, Dante's vow didn't last very long. Almost immediately, Dante began committing atrocious sins, not only for himself but in the name of God, and even betrayed Beatrice in the worst ways possible. Then, in 1191, Dante began his journey, a journey started by the plunging of a knife and a meeting with the Grim Reaper, who informed Dante of his damnation. But Dante wasn't really having that, so he decided to take the Grim Reaper's scythe and kill him with it. He abandoned the war and sought to return home and redeem himself in the comfort of his beloved Beatrice. But upon his return, he discovered his father dead, and even worse, he discovered Beatrice was dead. Her soul was then snatched by Lucifer, who proceeded to start bringing her to hell. And with fearless, unrelenting purpose, Dante leapt after her, starting his journey, starting his redemption, starting his legend. His journey through the Inferno to rescue the woman he loved from the clutches of the Prince of Lies. Along his journey, he met such notable characters as Charon, the boatman of souls, King Minos, who served as the judge of the damned at the end of Limbo. In the circle of lust, he encountered both Cleopatra and her lover, Mark Antony. In the circle of gluttony, Dante encountered a heavily made-over Cerberus. His father, unsurprisingly, in the circle of greed, the angry ferryman of the river Styx in the circle of anger, Phlegyas, his would-have-been brother-in-law Francesco in the circle of violence, specifically violence against God, and finally, in the circle of traitors, the fallen angel himself, Lucifer, who, once defeated, reveals to Dante that he has been kind of deluded throughout the entirety of his journey. That knife stab in the beginning of the game was the same knife stab that killed him. Yes, throughout almost the entire game, Dante has in fact been dead, and has actually been going through his own personal hell, having warranted several circles throughout his life. And as a second plot twist, the realization that Lucifer really didn't care about Beatrice, and that him kidnapping and wedding her in the Inferno was merely bait to try and get Dante to follow him down and so release him from the chains of Giudecca and allow him to slip through purgatory, enter paradise, and take what he called his rightful place back. Now before we go any further, let's do a quick recap of Dante's sins. The second circle of lust when he cheated on Beatrice, the third circle of gluttony in his off time, the fifth circle of anger in his general attitude towards non-Christians, The sixth circle of heresy in his general views that Muslim lives were worth less than Christian ones. The seventh circle, violence, specifically violence against God, for the following statement made by Dante.
The souls are already lost!
And finally, the ninth, lowest, worst circle of treachery, for allowing his would-have-been brother-in-law Francesco to take the blame for the prison massacre that Dante committed. But despite having earned his place in the Inferno several times over, he did in fact collect a lot of souls on his pilgrimage, which he used in order to bind Lucifer in hell a little more securely than he was before. Dante then exits the Inferno, enters Purgatory, and unfortunately, in his removal of his tapestry, introduces sin into Purgatory. Great going. Created alongside the other Nephilim from the mingled dusts of angel and demon, Death watched for an unknown period of time as his people slaughtered their way across creation, until he and his three fellows, who would become the Horsemen, aligned themselves with the body known as the Charred Council. In exchange for their continued survival, as well as immense power, these four riders were charged with the destruction of their people. The souls of the fallen Nephilim would be collected and destroyed, so as to prevent them from ever returning to wreak the same destruction that they had for years. Centuries and possibly millennia later, war stood accused of triggering the apocalypse on Earth, and Death, believing his brother's innocence, rode forth in an effort to save him. His first stop was a frigid realm called the Icy Veil. The Icy Veil served as the dwelling for an entity known as the Crowfather, the same being who Death now approached, seeking aid. The Crowfather would only agree to help if Death would take back the amulet that contained the Nephilim's souls. Following Death's refusal of these terms, the Crowfather took on a likeness of Death's brother, War, and the two did battle. And while it was a titanic struggle, Death ultimately prevailed. In the last moments of the battle, the amulet shattered and embedded itself in Death's chest. And in what seems to be his final living act, the Crowfather opened up a portal that swallowed up Death, transporting him to an ancient world occupied by an ancient people called the Makers. These Makers were not only responsible for the creation of the White City of Heaven, but also of the Dark Towers of Hell and countless worlds that made up creation. On the home world of the Makers, Death found himself in a rather convoluted series of tasks that involved him reacquiring several locations for these Makers, in an effort for them to help awaken one of their greatest weapons, a giant stone construct. Unfortunately, upon awakening, the construct was corrupted, possessed by the very personified corruption that was attempting to destroy the Maker's homeworld. Death naturally did battle with the massive creature, and of course defeated it, only for it to have to be put right back together so that it could serve its original purpose and give a royal beatdown to this physical embodiment of corruption. With the corruption cleared, Death could finally proceed to his original objective, the massive tree that connected the various worlds of creation, the Tree of Life, very similar to Yggdrasil from Nordic mythology. But once inside, Death realized that the tree was already occupied. It was occupied by Absalom, the first Nephilim and Death's older brother, the older brother who Death killed. Finding himself in the kingdom of the dead and in the presence of the merchant Ostenath, Death was advised to go seek the Lord of Bones, the ruler of this realm. Completing a number of tasks before and after his audience with the Lord of the Dead was necessary for Death to receive a bit more enlightenment about the true nature of the tree. Being assigned the ghost of Crowfather as a guide, Death finally realized what the true nature of the tree was, and what was inside. Inside the tree was an object known as the Well of Souls, a kind of gateway that souls would use after their death and purification to be reborn back to life. But in order to access the well, Death would need a pair of keys, each key kept by the angels and demons. To retrieve the angel key, Death was sent to Lost Light, an angelic outpost. For the demon key, he was sent to the Black Stone, another outpost where demons kept watch instead, and also the home of the incredibly powerful demon Samael. Once both keys were in his possession, Death was finally ready to confront the brother he thought he killed eons ago, and ready to save the brother that he had now. But he still had that one final task ahead of him. And there, standing tall and proud as the champion of corruption, was Absalom, Death's big brother. And there, in the Well of Souls, the two Nephilim fought. The fate of not only war, but also of humanity itself, hanging in the balance. But eventually, Death managed to prove that he was the better warrior. Absalom then, in his dying moments, tried to get one last bit of mercy from his younger brother. Death wasn't having that. It was now that Death had the choice: to revive the Nephilim, his people, from the amulet within his chest, or to revive mankind and save his brother War. For Death, it wasn't even a choice. He would always seek to protect his family, and so cast himself into the Well of Souls, using the souls of the Nephilim to revive humanity and undo the crime that War was accused of. Just to address a few little details before we really get started in the examination, we will be taking Dante as he's portrayed in the Dante's Inferno game, but not how he's portrayed in the original Divine Comedy book. Furthermore, he will not have access to either the Damned or the Holy ability trees that are available to players in the game. This is to try and create as much of a fair fight as possible. Death will be taken from his portrayal in the Darksiders 2 game, as well as a few references and excerpts from his stints in the comics. Furthermore, much like Dante, he will not have access to his skill trees, in his case his Harbinger and Necromancer skill trees. Again, this is in an effort to keep things fair. As always, we'll first start by examining their physical ability. Dante is a well-built human male in his mid-30s. To get an idea of how strong Dante is, we're going to take a look at his use of his weapons, in particular his halberd in the beginning of the game. Since the halberd is a real weapon, we can estimate its weight and from there get an idea of how strong Dante is by his use of it. The problem arises by the fact that the halberd was a pretty widespread weapon. Thus, different designs alter its weight by significant margins. However, the typical halberd usually weighed anywhere from 15 to about 30 pounds, depending upon how it was designed and what materials were used. Looking at Dante's halberd in this image allowed me to form what is, and I will admit, is a very conservative estimation on how much this weapon weighs. If we estimate the wooden pole that forms the shaft of the weapon as being 6 feet long, and by what it seemed in the image about 2 inches in diameter, this would put it at around 5 pounds on its own. When you take the counterweight in the back into account, possibly being even solid metal, at the very least it's about 10 pounds. To balance all that out, and at least another 10 pounds to the axe head on top. This means that, and again, I repeat, this is my conservative estimation, this weapon probably weighs around 25 pounds, if not more, which makes how he uses it not only impressive, but also kind of understandable. His basic attack combo has a certain flowing grace to it, but you have to really take a close look to see it. You can kind of notice how when he swings his scythe, aside from a few opening moves, most of them seem to rely upon starting the momentum and then just keep it going until the enemies are gone. And the way he uses his scythe is identical move for move. Another feat of strength that Dante routinely shows is that he's strong enough to essentially do a super pull-up and pull himself up onto ledges. Considering the difficulty that most people would have in even doing pull-ups at all, the fact that he's able to pull his entire body weight up high enough to essentially step onto edges that he's grabbed onto is very impressive. But one overwhelming detail that must be taken into account when looking at how Dante fights is that the way he handles his weapon seems to be more focused on keeping a continuous barrage of strikes going rather than focus on a number of short, choppy, but really powerful strikes. This makes me believe that he, even at his most aggressive, isn't what you might call a strength-based fighter. Death is actually very similar in his combative focus. His method is very similar in that he's trying to keep up a constant barrage of strikes, but he frequently incorporates dodges and leaps in order to avoid enemy retaliation and still get in strikes where he can. Also like Dante, Death shows more impressive strength in his navigation of the terrain rather than in combat. This is a being who, when he encounters scalable wooden beams in his environment, climbs them in ways that not even the contestants from Ninja Warrior would ever dare try. And perhaps most impressive in the early portion of the game is his blade lock with Crowfather's Imitation War as a boss fight. While it is unclear whether or not Crowfather managed to exactly replicate War's strength in this form, it is worth noting that every time this foe War and Death clashed weapons, it kicked up some pretty heavy dust clouds. So in regards to strength in terms of physical ability, I have to go with neither one getting an edge. There's just not enough information for me to make a decision in this that I'm comfortable with. Dante has a roll ability that's very similar to Kratos's from God of War. While it does allow him to cover ground pretty quickly, what's most impressive about this is the sheer distance it covers in such a short period of time. Its usefulness in avoiding both close strikes and ranged attacks is not to be understated. But while that's impressive, Death's ability to do a parallel wall jump in order to get some pretty good distance up is worthy of note. Furthermore, Death is quite the capable gymnast. This is a particularly impressive series of flips when you factor in that beneath this is a seemingly bottomless pit that would for sure kill Death if he ever fell. But in direct combat, Death's agility is well worth noting. And in this clip, we get to see Death jumping from one floating stone to the next in order to gain height for a final attack. His degree of agility and speed is staggering in order to handle this kind of terrain so easily. In regards to these two combatants' speed and agility, I have to go with Dante in regards to speed. His roll ability allows him to cover so much distance so quickly. But in terms of agility, I have to go with Death. He's just staggering in how acrobatic he is, and how fluidly he moves from one position to the next. As a little side note to their speed, I also wish to talk about these characters in terms of their reflexes in combat. Death was able to keep pace with a rapidly teleporting Samael, and then cleverly anticipate him enough to land a hit. And not long prior to his fight with Samael, he was able to react to a demon teleporting behind him quite quickly. But given the mechanics of Dante's Inferno, Dante never really showcases anything that you might call lightning fast reflexes. In regards to the endurance of these two combatants, it's a little trickier to determine. Dante's Inferno, much like the God of War series, is a game that can be played in only a few hours if you're really determined and you know what you're doing. This means that Dante's entire journey didn't take very long. It took maybe a few days if we really really stretch out the time he was down in hell. Now, before I go into my theory as to how long Death's quest was, I need to cover a few small details. First, the fact that War was basically imprisoned by the Charred Council for 100 years following the outbreak of the apocalypse. Now, I would normally expect a character like Death to basically depart almost immediately upon hearing this in order to prove his brother's innocence and try and get him freed. But even if we estimate that this took 20 years for him to figure out, and that would be just staggeringly slow, that means that his quest in order to revive humanity took 80 years to complete. Because I have a serious doubt that Death was just sitting around for 100 years while War was imprisoned, and over a course of a few days heard about this situation and decided to rush off to try and save him. I seriously doubt that this is how it went down with Death. But enough of that little tangent. Back to the actual examination. Dante's love for Beatrice is what spurred him to keep going until her soul was freed, and afterwards to confront Lucifer to ensure that he could never try something like this again, to essentially punish him for even attempting it. Death, with his millennia of combative experience, likely also has combative endurance down to a T. A little train of logic that I had in regards to Death's endurance centers around his mask. Now, for starters, we know that Death put on his mask just before he and his brothers went to kill the rest of the Nephilim. He has also been accredited as to never removing the mask in the time since. The mask clearly doesn't allow for the intake of food or drink. The following conclusion is that Death has no need for food or drink, as he has continued functioning perfectly without them for millennia, unless he's found some other way to intake them. This tells me that for all intents and purposes, Death and even the other Nephilim have no need for the various things that we humans need to continue functioning. Food, drink, maybe even sleep altogether. In fact, the only times in gameplay we ever see Death unconscious is with the amulet binding itself to him and his final meeting with the Lord of Bones. The binding of the amulet, I honestly think, has more to do with it binding itself to him as a person, body, mind, and spirit, rather than just searing itself into his flesh. In his final meeting with the Lord of Bones, the Lord says, and I quote, "Your shame stays its unlocking," in regards to the power of the amulet. He then proceeded to essentially dig his way into Death's mind, or maybe even his soul, in order to try and unlock the amulet and essentially bypass this block of shame. That sounds like it hurts. So Death being rendered unconscious by either of these events shouldn't be held against him too much, even if they do kind of give him a means of rest in his quest and do kind of work against him. Despite the aforementioned periods of rest or unconsciousness, whichever you choose, in his quest, Death, barring some ungodly twist of logic, was essentially going on his journey for at least a few decades, because we know that War was basically held up by the Council for 100 years following the apocalypse, and Death's quest ends pretty close to when War essentially summoned the other three horsemen at the end of his game. With all this said, it's very clear to me that Death was able to just keep going for longer than Dante did in his journey. So with that said, I have to conclude that the edge in endurance goes to Death. In regards to their pain tolerance, both of them have proven that they can take the pain when it's given to them. Dante sewed a tapestry of his sins onto his chest, the last stitch being the one that finally drew out a scream from him. Death has only ever made any sound of pain 3 times in the game. when the amulet bound itself to him, which I personally think has more to do with spirit than it did with body, when the Lord of Bones essentially dug into Death's mind in order to unlock the amulet's power, and in the flashback when he howls in anguish following the death of the Nephilim, which is kind of understandable given the circumstances. Here, Death got energy slapped through 2 floating stone islands and landed, not even brushing himself off. It didn't even bother him. To truly gauge the pain tolerance difference between the two, we're going to take another look back at the Darksider comic, which was heavily referenced in the Kratos War video, for more clarification. Here we see War impaling Death through the torso area with his sword Chaos Eater. And not only does Death not show any significant outward reaction, but he seems to regard it more like a nuisance than an actual injury. Furthermore, Strife in the same comic clip points out how Death is, in his own words, damn near invulnerable. That should show you just what kind of punishment this Nephilim can take. And it should also be explanation enough as to why I give Death the edge in pain tolerance. I'll take care of both their age and prior injury examination at the same time. As said before, Dante is in his mid-30s, which still puts him in his physical prime, and he has no prior injuries that give him any deficiencies in combat. Death is millennia old at the very least and has no prior injuries in which to hinder him in combat. Since he's a Nephilim, he is essentially immortal, so his age doesn't bother him either. Really, the only reason I even included these last 2 sections is because it keeps it uniform with the format that me and Reaper have established for these battles. But since it is in the format, I have to actually give the edge, and there's no edge in either age or prior injuries to either Dante or Death. Okay, I'm gonna straight out say it. Dante is a pretty impressive physical powerhouse for a human being, but he cannot compare to Death in terms of physical ability. Therefore, in terms of physical ability, I have to give the edge to Death for his superior speed, agility, and pain tolerance. Both of these combatants bring very similar arsenals to this fight. Dante is bringing the scythe that he took from the Grim Reaper and the weapon that he used throughout most of his journey. The scythe is essentially able to have its blade turn to make it work sort of like a spear, or it can have its shaft collapse down and turn the weapon essentially into a wrist blade from the Predator movies. To kill enemies at those distances that his scythe can't reach, he has the cross that Beatrice gave him just before he left for the Crusades. This cross is able to fire crosses of light that are able to sail a good distance and really reach those faraway targets. Death is bringing his own scythes into this fight as well. Death's weapon is typically kept in a pair of short scythes, essentially regular scythes with shortened handles. This allows him to keep his attacks going kind of barrage style. Just keep in mind that the pair of short scythes is just how Death is comfortable in carrying and using his weapon. They are more than capable of combining into a regular scythe in order to add to his combos or to finish off opponents. Furthermore, it seems that Death can, when he chooses to, essentially go Darth Maul with his weapon and just conjoin the bases of his short scythe handles into what could basically be described as a double-ended scythe. For his long range, Death is bringing in his brother Strife's pistol, Redemption, which was given to him by the maker Alia in the Forge Lands during his quest there. This pistol is ideal for dispatching small enemies or to hit objects in those hard-to-reach areas. The pistol is capable of being rather precise when coupled with Death's lock-on ability, which sort of works the same way as the Z targeting from the Legend of Zelda series. As an added bonus, Death has his horse, Despair, which I count as a piece of his equipment as it is something that he can use on a frequent basis. This horse, obviously, grants him increased speed and mobility in areas that permit him to be around. Looking at the two, their equipment stands toe-to-toe in most cases. Dante's scythe has options in its alternative forms, but Death's scythes have just as many forms and just as much versatility. The real difference came down to their long-range weapons. Dante's cross is a powerful weapon and one you don't want to be too close to if he starts using it. But therein lies the issue. You don't want to be too close. Dante's cross essentially works much the same way as a shotgun. The crosses essentially spacing themselves out from each other to try and hit a larger area. But Death's pistol is much more precise and much more accurate, perfect for engagements with single opponents or groups of really weak ones. Which when coupled with his lock-on ability, make him all the more dangerous. And when you factor in Death's horse Despair, it just puts the advantage solely in his corner. Now don't get me wrong, both of these characters are bringing some pretty formidable arsenals to the table. It's just that Death's weapons are more well suited for this situation and this kind of conflict than Dante's weapons are. The edge in weapons goes to Death. As stated prior, both these characters will be without their game's respective skill trees. Dante without his holy and unholy skill trees, and Death without his Harbinger or Necromancer skill trees. Despite this, both these characters do have abilities that the player will attain in gameplay regardless of which skill tree they go with. Dante acquires 4 spells during his journey. The first of them is Righteous Path, where Dante charges forward in an energy-empowered bull rush with exploding crystals in his wake. Lust Storm, which he obtains in the Circle of Lust, surrounds the user in an energy cloud that harms any enemies that get too close. Sins of the Father, which is attained in the Circle of Greed after defeating Alighiero, essentially attacks the enemy with flying, homing crosses, damaging them regardless of where they hide. And the Fruit of Suicide, which is attained following Dante's meeting with his mother in the Circle of Violence. This creates a large area of stunning and damaging for anything caught in it. He also has his Retribution form, which allows him to increase his striking power and durability while at the same time increasing his speed into a frenzy of scythe strikes. Death has his own abilities that he uses throughout his journey as well. His ability, Death Grip, works sort of like a grappling hook to grab onto distant handholds or to bring small enemies closer to him, or himself closer to larger enemies if they have enough mass to them. Interdiction, attained in the realm of the dead, allows Death to summon and command the Lords of the Dead Court. The ability Soul Splitter allows Death to create 2 glowing energy copies of himself that allow him to be in 2 places at the same time and perform tasks that would normally require at least 2 people to otherwise do. Death also attained a Void Walker, just like War did on Earth, which allows him to use specially marked gateways in order to create portals between one location and another. This was eventually upgraded to the Phase Walker, which did the same thing, only it opened doorways through time rather than doorways through space. He also has the ability to summon his horse Despair almost anywhere he is. Finally is his Reaper form, which is essentially a really big version of himself that he uses to finish off boss enemies or anything else that's in his way. When looking at the two, there is a certain distinction between their abilities. Death's abilities are very exploration based, ideal for the kind of environments he finds himself in. But Dante's abilities are much more combatively oriented, meant for direct combat and taking down enemies. And for that reason, I have to give the edge in special abilities to Dante. When comparing these two in terms of intellect, we have to take into account the time frames that they lived and the kind of things they faced during their journeys. As the game's Dante did live in the 12th century, this means that by modern standards his education is pretty lacking. Despite this, he was able to traverse all 9 circles of hell. In particular, the fourth circle of greed. In the Dante's Inferno developmental diaries, it was described that greed was a very cerebral kind of level, very puzzle-filled, and thus requiring a decent amount of intelligence to navigate. Death has oftentimes been described as the crafter of the Nephilim during his time with them, having crafted his own weapon, the Harvester, and being the brains behind using the now extinct race known as the Ravaim to create the abominations, weapons that were capable of destroying worlds or protecting the user with unimaginable power. Furthermore, Death was able to navigate 3 major dungeons on the Maker's homeworld. Now, the Makers were beings who created worlds as a living, so for them, any kind of structure they make is bound to be something that requires a bit of brains to navigate. Coupled with the fact that Death is eons old, means that he probably has learned a lot more in his lifetime than Dante could have ever learned in his. With all this said, it shouldn't be surprising who I'm giving the intellect edge to. Dante is impressive, yes, but Death has been around for so much longer and done so much more. It just goes without saying. Intellect edge goes to Death. In terms of their psychological balance, there is a certain similarity between the two that served as the basis for this matchup. In Dante's case, he sewed a tapestry representing his sins onto his chest, and he carried a certain guilt with him throughout the entirety of his journey that he only came to terms with when he entered purgatory and removed his tapestry, finally coming to terms with and forgiving himself for the sins he had committed. Death is likewise a self-marked sinner, being the only of the horsemen to genuinely feel guilt for when he rode and destroyed the rest of the Nephilim. The mask he wore was his badge of shame, and one that he wore for millennia until he decided to sacrifice the souls of the Nephilim to revive humanity. Aside from their guilt over the crimes they have committed, both of these characters are psychologically stable. They don't have any kind of mental illnesses that inhibit them or give them advantages. As such, I have to say that there is no advantage given for psychological balance. In terms of personality, Dante is somewhat aggressive in how he does things, oftentimes having a certain disrespect for those damned in the Inferno. And while he has only had a few outbursts of what you might call temper, he is still a largely aggressive individual when you take into account his history. In short, Dante has a personality that you would expect from a Crusader. Devoutly religious, certainly aggressive, and kind of dismissive and disrespectful to even the ruling class in the Inferno. Death, on the other hand, is known for being very quiet and kind of calculating. He has only had a few instances where he's assumed an aggressive stance or had a temperamental outburst. In regards to Death assuming a more aggressive posture, they always occurred when he thought someone was assuming war's guilt in the crimes he was accused of. In terms of temperamental outbursts, the 2 notable examples are when the Lord of Bones destroyed the lords of his court after Death had pretty much jumped through numerous hoops to collect them, which Death didn't exactly appreciate, and when Lilith describes Death's actions against the Nephilim eons ago as his sins, Death kind of blows up on her. But considering that this is Lilith he was talking to, I can kind of understand his frustration. In regards to their personalities, the edge is easy to give when you look at each one's description. Death is typically a very calm, collected, level-headed individual, while Dante has the typically aggressive kind of personality that you would expect from a Crusader. As such, I feel absolute comfort giving the edge in personality to Death. In regards to their strategic inclination, it's actually pretty interesting. Dante is capable of both identifying and disabling enemy advantage, as well as using the environment to his own advantage. as when he used the flames in his battle against Cerberus to stun the creature in order to get his attacks in, or when he used the floating chunks of rock in order to gain height and so actually land some strikes on Lucifer in his final battle down in the Inferno. The latter example being how Dante managed to actually finally defeat Lucifer down in the Ninth Circle. Death also shows a certain ingenuity in how he approaches combat, but there's a certain problem. While it is true that Death is capable of identifying and then exploiting enemy weaknesses and weak zones, he has always had it basically thrown in his face whenever he enters combat. You don't really need to think about where you need to hit the enemy. And while he does use the environment to pretty good effect, there is still one glaring problem. Much of Death's fighting style is very direct and assaulting. And this is odd considering that he's not exactly an offensive powerhouse like his brother War. But the fact remains that most of his tactics rely upon brutalizing the enemy. Just as with the personality edge, I feel no problem in giving this edge in strategic inclination to Dante. He has proven his own abilities in strategizing and figuring out his enemy's weaknesses time and time again. Death, he doesn't have such opportunities with the enemies he faces. Now, in regards to experience, since we know Dante was at least in his mid-30s when he died, there is still the fact that he had those decades in order to train, study, and learn. But Death was around for millennia before the Third Crusades ever were an idea, before Dante was even an idea. So the fact is, he has millennia of time and combat experience. Back in the physical ability area, the age had no advantages or disadvantages for either opponent. However, in this particular case, age actually gives Death a significant advantage in regards to his experience. He has been around and in battle for millennia, which, when compared to Dante's maybe 2 decades of experience, is a staggering advantage in his corner. Dante just cannot compare to Death in this area. As such, I give the edge in mind to Death. So I think you can kind of see where this is going. Death has managed to claim the advantage in physical ability, weapons, and mind, while Dante's only advantage lies in his special abilities. When I first started this examination, back in the research phase, I had no doubts in my mind who would win. The real reason behind this matchup, despite the fact that it is very obvious, is to examine the thematic relevance between these two characters. They're both being self-marked sinners. They both went on these massive journeys in order to save people they cared about, and kind of more on the surface area, they're both scythe wielders. What started the entire idea was the question of, if Dante could defeat the Grim Reaper in his game, how would he fare against another version, another imagining of Death? As for how the fight would actually go, the best way I can imagine it goes something like this. The two would encounter each other and be a decent distance away from one another as they kind of sized each other up. Dante would go on the offensive first, going in close and trying to take Death down with his scythe. Death would let him approach, having initially been more inclined to disregard Dante as not being too much of a threat or even worth note, because he didn't have any reason to fight him. But once Dante got close, Death would retaliate with his own scythes, the paired nature allowing him to fight in such a way that Dante couldn't immediately react to. This initial failure would land a few hits on Dante, and he would realize very quickly that being up close is probably not the best idea. So he would get his distance and start using his cross. Death, having fought holy enemies before, likely would have been able to recognize such an attack pretty quickly and would very easily identify that the crosses are separating from each other at a very rapid pace and simply jump to the side and avoid them. Death would then retaliate with Redemption, and considering that Dante's block is ideal for melee attacks, I don't think it would be too effective against this pistol. Dante, now sporting a good deal more damage than Death does, would start resorting to his magic in order to try and level the playing field a bit. Righteous Path would probably be his first choice, and he would likely get at least a few hits in with it, maybe 2 or 3, before Death wisened up and learned how to avoid it by simply jumping to the side, as the spell requires a completely straight line in order to attack. The Fruit of Suicide would probably be the next spell he would use in an effort to try and make Death not able to avoid the attack by utilizing its area kind of effect. But while I do think that Death would probably take a bit of damage from this, it wouldn't be enough to really put him in any mortal danger. In fact, I would think that when Death would be stunned by the Suicide Fruit, Dante would try and get in close again in order to use his scythe. And even if Death managed to escape the Suicide Fruit's field in time, Death would still be in trouble because Dante would likely use the Lust Storm spell in order to make himself as dangerous an opponent to stand next to as possible. But there would be a slight flaw in Dante's plan. Death is not an idiot. He's not some moronic demon from the Inferno. He's smart enough to realize that if your opponent is surrounded by a swirling purple lightning storm tornado, it's probably not a good idea to get too close to them. Whatever magical energy Dante has left after all this is probably only enough to cast maybe 1 or 2 spells. And I think now he would finally start using the Sins of the Father spell. His avoidance of it so far being mostly rooted in his disliking for his father and anything associated with him, which is unfortunate considering that the spell would have probably been the most useful against Death. By now, Dante is out of magical energy and has once again returned to having to use martial skill in order to try and subdue and defeat Death. He'd probably try and use Redemption in order to lay in as much damage as he could, and then once that meter ran out, try and stick with the scythe and cross in order to damage Death as much as he could. But I think that if Death is able to summon Despair from wherever he summons him from, that the moment Dante enters Redemption, he's going to start using his horse to try and keep distance and try and minimize his damage intake. It's likely here that Death would start using his own abilities, like Death Grip, in order to pull Dante around and keep him off balance, or use his Reaper form in order to take as much of a chunk out of Dante's health as he could. On a side note, if Death wasn't able to summon Despair, then I would think that the moment Dante went into Redemption stage, he would be faced with Death in his Reaper form. And since the Reaper form is pretty much invulnerable to any form of attack, Dante would essentially be trying to beat down a brick wall with his head. It wouldn't get him anywhere. Whereas Death's strength in his Reaper form would be more than enough to overcome any defensive boosts that Dante has while in Redemption mode. By now, the fight is decidedly one-sided and quickly turning into a victory for Death. Dante having taken too much damage and not being able to do anything really to stop Death. The final bit of the battle would be pure martial skill, scythe versus scythe. But eventually, Death's sheer eons of experience with his weapon would trump Dante's relative inexperience with his own. And Death would eventually land the killing blow, and Dante would fall. Now, we could only hope that Death would be a little more merciful to Dante than he was to Crowfather here, and not, stab him in the back with his scythe. That would not be pleasant. As such, I declare Death, the Horseman of the Apocalypse, the Kinslayer, the Executioner, as the winner of this battle. Now, on a certain side note, to point out why I went through all this and had an option to just be lazy in regards to Dante, the Grim Reaper's journal entry in the game describes his scythe as separating the bond between soul and body. And while I understand that even though it's a bit of a different description than the description applied to Chaos Eater, which is described as consuming the souls of those it kills. The fact that Death took a decidedly lethal hit from such a weapon makes me suspect that enchanted weapons like that really can't do much against Death. Now, if I really wanted to be lazy, I could have just said that since there are certain similarities between Dante's scythe and War's sword, that Dante's scythe couldn't do anything against Death since War's sword didn't do anything against Death. But I decided to not do that in an effort to actually do a matchup that has actually interested me for some time now. Has and always will be stated, this is just my opinion, this is just how I interpreted the game, the lore, and the story behind these characters, and thus, if you disagree with my opinion, please be civil about it, and just message us at the channel email, or comment below, and give me the reason why you feel the way you do. And please, don't be hesitant about it, I'm actually very interested in such things. I'd also like to take this time to thank Luis Rams for his Dante's Inferno walkthrough. Without him, I would not have been able to give you the images that you see here today. And Kashimaru Click Click for his work on the Darksiders 2 walkthrough. Without him, this video would not have been able to be made either. Special thanks to Baoban Shi for their work on the music for this video. I thank you for allowing me to use this, and I would suggest you give all these YouTubers a visit if you really want to. Their work is actually pretty good.
Don't you two ever tire of failing in your mission? You've really become quite an inconvenience for me.
Nothing will protect you from me. Not men, not weapons, not armor!